Everything in life is story. Story is how we share ideas, politics, vision, fantasies, experiences, even our hopes and dreams. The Gibson Gazette is a podcast show devoted to story. Those we consume, those we tell ourselves, and those told to us. Hello, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, whatever time you're listening in. This is AMC and Marie Collymore here with our lovely help me out here, LMG. Look, the words are just like, they're not even coming anymore.
That's what you get for trying to
Like,
be fancy. You was trying to be fancy.
I'm suffering.
And now you suffering because the Caribbean respectability was kicking in. You was trying to be all proper with it. Nah.
It's the Caribbean. You're going to take me out before the end of this show.
Anyway, so this is your boy LMG, coupled with my girl AMC, and today we have our new third co-host, Adrianne Traylor. Now, Adrianne, let me know if I mispronounced your last name, because in my head I have been calling it Taylor forever, and then saw that R was sneaking up in there, messing with the Taylor.
You and everybody else, and I actually have people ask me, "Are you sure it's not Taylor?" Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
You wouldn't know, right?
It's Traylor.
Oh, man.
Adrianne, AT, AMC, LMG,
yes,
and AT.
yes,
AT, you wanna let the people know? I mean, unless you got a middle name, you want to give us a 3 initial thing for you as well. We can work with it.
I do have a middle name. I don't necessarily want to disclose it, but I will say you can feel free to call me ALT.
ALT, look,
ALT.
Look. That's sweet. That's smooth. That's smooth.
Alt is smooth. I don't know. We call alt.
Yes.
Why are you gonna do that? Why are you gonna do that?
I'm gonna choose. Yes.
All right, ALT. You want to introduce yourself as our new third co-host for the show?
Sure. So, as LMG said, I am Adrianne Traylor, ALT. I do not have the same cultural cachet as my co-host, but I am originally from Texas. I have been living in Brooklyn for the last 11 years. I am...
Okay.
Yeah, I am actually a former, still licensed in Texas, a former therapist who is now in human resources and consulting. And I also have a background in theater and used to write theater reviews, Broadway and off-Broadway, for a arts journal that's actually located in North Texas called Theater Jones. And focus of the journal and its founders has shifted a bit in the last few years, particularly due to the pandemic. So not actively writing for them now, but still have the mindset there. And I'm a lover of the arts, theater, music, TV, film, all that good stuff.
And you're a longtime Gibson Gazetter, which
Yes,
is one of the
absolutely.
reasons why we included you. Adrianne is being real humble, y'all, real modest. She's giving you the real details, the history, the deconstruction of these film and TV shows. I thought she was teaching an academia in cultural studies. I was like, sis, if you got some time away from your students. She was like, what students? What you talking about? I was like, your students. Because she's kicking knowledge.
I'm a student myself, and just recently finished a second master's degree. So, I am not unfortunately in the arts, in industrial and organizational psychology, but and very very happy to be done with this academic grind for the time being, so I can get back to the
Mhm.
to the stuff that I really love, which is all the
Yeah,
stuff we're
well,
going to be
we
talking about
welcome you.
on this podcast. Thank you
Absolutely. I
so
mean, obviously,
much.
we
Thank you.
welcome you. AMC and I
Yes.
welcome you. We're excited to have a third. We're one of the few podcasts that are two black women and one black guy, as opposed to the
Yes.
usual flip of two black guys and one black woman. So that was
Mhm.
interesting and important to us. And we want to make sure we could be a little more consistent. AMC and LMG
Mhm.
have demonstrated we're not always the most consistent about dropping the podcast when we're supposed to. So,
All facts. Can't even lie. All
so
facts.
sometimes it's gonna be LMG and AMC. Sometimes it's gonna be ALT and AMC. Sometimes it's gonna be
Hmm.
ALT and LMG. Just because we want to make sure we don't miss, and we're all very busy. We all have very full lives, but we are dedicated to this show. We're dedicated to this season of nostalgia, of Gen X nostalgia, and we want to make
Mhm.
Yes.
sure that we brought on a third that whose opinion we appreciated and whose expertise we wanted to include. Talking about, I'm not as esteemed. And meanwhile, oh, by the way, I'm on my second master's, so this is something extra that I was doing on the side in between theater reviews and helping people's lives with therapy. So like, all of that little stuff that's barely mentioned,
Why is he
right?
like this? Why
I
is
mean,
he like
look,
this?
why y'all
Oh.
like this? Shine your
This
spotlight, girl.
exact.
You're
That's why
doing
we're
lots
here,
of good
because
stuff
he's
out
like
here in
this.
this world, right? Shine your spotlight and give and glow, baby, glow. All right, so
That's right.
today's show, I'm gonna hurry up because AMC has already told us her baby coming in like 45 minutes, and so
Oh,
she ain't
okay.
got all day
Okay.
to
Oh,
be on
oh
this
my
topic
God.
with us.
We
Even though
understand
And I'm throwing in air
priorities.
quotes on that.
Priorities.
uh,
Priorities.
that's right. That
Yes.
I'm
baby was
gonna
gonna
get
sit
the
in that
child to
lap.
call LMG. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get him to call LMG.
Look, you just put the baby in your lap. We okay with the baby can cool and say things in between our commentary. Um,
You're talking about who? This 5-year-old going on 100? You're mad. Nah, we ain't doing that. We are not doing that.
anyway, look, add a little baby spice to the show, a little toddler
That's
spice.
Mm,
right.
Um,
We
mm,
never know what insights may be there. Come on now.
from the
ooh.
mouths of babes, but he might be like, "No, mommy, Whitney Houston's bodyguard was not number two; it was number one."
All of his chat will be Marvel related. So I don't even know where we're gonna go with that.
Look,
But anyways,
Marvel got some Wakanda Forever and Black Panther both were
oh
black
yeah, he
soundtracks.
will.
Yes.
Yes, yes,
So
indeed, and he will talk tirelessly about them. But moving on, let's go. Let's do
moving
this.
on, exactly. So obviously
Yeah.
tonight's topic is gonna be '90s era black movie soundtracks.
Hmm.
AMC, you want to tell us why you selected this as your nostalgia, one of your top nostalgia conversations for us to have this season, and then I can go into the history of the thing.
I mean, I chose it because it was a time where music just it accompanied movies. There was nothing like it, and I think that back then we were the go-to product wise when it came to studios trying to find stories to put on the big screen. And it was a time where we actually showed them that, hey, we have star power. And hey, they're, when movies are supported and rooted in our culture, we will go out and support them in droves. So with the good movies, we had some really, really dope soundtracks. And that we just don't get anymore. And you won't hear, like, the 90s were ram packed with black movies and black soundtracks that really just took it to a whole other level. Where soundtracks come out now and they're great, I'm sure, but they just don't hold that same level of um, nostalgia or I don't know, they just don't take you to a place like those soundtracks do. So a lot of them still bump today. A lot of the tracks still bump today. On a lot of playlists and a lot of youngins that are listening to them things again because we all stuck in the 90s and we can't stop playing the music. So and a large component of the music from then is from soundtracks. So yeah, that's kind of the big reason why I chose my 90s soundtracks.
And do you have any thoughts about 90s era soundtracks, Adrian AT? I know you didn't were not as into black music in the 90s. That was a different phase for
I
you. We had that conversation
yeah,
privately.
yes,
But
yes.
what of that era do you remember that stands out for you as a fellow Gen Xer?
Well, yeah, like we talked about, this was this was dull, dark days for me when it came um to black movies and black movie soundtracks because I was in a very different environment, and not not as attuned to what was happening in black cinema, and particularly in the soundtracks. Of course, I had familiarity with the big ones I think that we remember from that time. Waiting to Exhale, Boomerang. Uh, there was one that I had actually thought about, and I was like, did I actually hear this whole soundtrack? I don't know if I did, but I think it was Love Jones that I was thinking of. And but there's a lot that I missed and a lot that I need to catch up on and familiarize myself with. So I'm looking forward to this because I want to be able to go back and say, "Oh yeah, let me get into that. Let me dig into some things that I missed when they were fresh and new, and rediscover some stuff."
Mm-mm.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so I want to make sure that we're first paying homage to how we even get to a 1990s era black soundtrack dominated period. So we give this a quick history lesson. First, we get Quincy Jones as the first black composer of a film score for a major motion picture with 1964's The Pawnbroker. Right? Like, so before that, there was no black folks, maybe an Oscar for Oscar Michaud films, right? Because Oscar Michaud
Mhm.
films were self-contained black films by black people for black people. But in the major Hollywood studio system, we weren't getting black composers, right? And so it's an interesting time because Quincy Jones at this point had already broken one glass ceiling by becoming the vice president of Mercury Records in 1961. And this is the same year that Sidney Lumet, the director for The Pawnbroker, invited Quincy to bring his special brand of jazz to, and this is like height of bebop era, right? So, and hard bop. So bring that kind of sensibility to the motion picture, which was a success. And it was such a success that Quincy went on to do 40 major motion picture scores, including things like In the Heat of the Night, The Italian Job, Cactus Flower, They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, The Getaway, classic films. Also, we know we get Quincy for things like the Stanford and Son theme song, Ironside, for those of us of a certain age,
Oh,
the Bill
right.
Cosby Show, right? The opening episodes for Roots, which makes sense that Quincy would also do the music for something that he actually produced, right? Right. Um, and so you get Quincy Jones kind of as the pioneer of black folks even being involved in Hollywood in a musical level. And then we fast forward to Isaac Hayes in 1971 with Shaft, and Shaft is important, even though there are only three vocal selections on that whole soundtrack. Um, it's more score than soundtrack. When we think about Shaft, we think of Shaft for the main theme song and Do Your Thing, but the actual soundtrack is mostly film score. So again, this is slightly different from what we would get in the 90s when it wasn't so much film score, but mostly songs, like actual songs that could be on the radio. Now, the interesting thing about Shaft is it becomes the summer it's released, it becomes the first double album of original studio material released by any R&B artist. So we get another pioneer through Isaac Hayes. It becomes the number one album on the Billboard 200 chart for a movie soundtrack. So he's the first to do that. It spent 60 weeks on the chart, 60 weeks,
Wow.
and took the top position on top R&B albums for 14 of those weeks. It achieved platinum status, which back then meant 2 million copies sold within a month of its release. And both the theme from Shaft and Do Your Thing become top 40 singles. Now, Shaft is more often remembered less for its Grammy Award wins, but it won several. It won Best Engineered Recording Non-Classical, Best Instrumental Arrangement. Um, but what it's most known for is winning the Academy Award for Best Song. So Shaft and Isaac Hayes becomes the first African American to win an Oscar for a non-acting category, with the theme from Shaft winning for Best Original Song. Now, he also got nominated for score, but he lost that year to Michael Legrand for Summer 42. But Shaft demonstrated to Hollywood something that it did not know before, which was that these recordings of film scores could actually be used to promote and market and sell films. Elvis Mitchell talks about this in his most recent documentary for Netflix. I think it's "Am I Black Enough for You" or something like that. I can't think of the title. But yeah, so we get after we get Shaft, which is so significant that in 2014 it was added to the National Recording Registry for the Library of Congress for being culturally and historically and aesthetically significant. But after you get that, you get Curtis Mayfield's Superfly album, Donny Hathaway's Comeback Charleston Blue, Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man, James Brown Black Caesar, Willie Hutch's The Mac and Foxy Brown. You know, this is like the height of blaxploitation era films, some 275 plus films starring Black people, sometimes directed by Black people, not always. But the music became part of marketing and promoting these albums. And it's important to realize this is also before we get to a video era, right? And while most of these are still kind of following the Shaft motif of being mostly score, mostly demonstrating the musicality of these composers, these Black artists that we think of as singers, as composers, um, you also get some exceptions, like Rolls Royce's Car Wash, which is an iconic Black movie soundtrack from that era. You get Curtis Mayfield's Gladys Knight and the Pips soundtrack for Claudine, which is one of their top 5 best-selling albums ever. And those are not scores; those are mostly songs, and songs that are radio ready to help promote these films. So you get Black folks listening to the songs on the radio, thinking about the film, and all of that is helping to promote and market films, as well as also being another revenue stream for Hollywood, which in the 1970s was suffering really badly, which is how we even get blaxploitation, right? Like they weren't even trying to give Black folks this kind of chance until the studio system collapsed and Hollywood was in a lot of trouble and needed to be able to be bailed out by a lot of low budget films with high profitability. So that's some of the differences between kind of the 1970s soundtracks and when the end of blaxploitation, you kind of get an end of the Black soundtrack for the 1980s with some exceptions like the breakdancing movies like Breakin' and Breakdancing 2, Electric Boogaloo, crazy stuff like that. But for the most part in the 80s, you don't really get a lot of Black soundtracks, outside of maybe like Fame, or, here and there, some stuff comes up. And then kind of like what you described now, like there isn't a lot of investment in the Black soundtrack as a marketing tool and vehicle and as something that becomes the soundtrack of our lives like it was in the 70s and like it would be again for the 1990s. Now, lastly, I think it's important to also note that between those 2 decades of the 70s and the 90s, video became something, MTV became something, and now you get the radio helping to promote the movie. and you get a video, which essentially is an extended long form trailer and commercial for the movie with the artist singing their hit or their song over, video stills and video clips of the film, which, by the way, they don't have to, the Hollywood doesn't have to pay for, right? Like for these video placements as much as they would placing a commercial advertisement on TV. So then the 90s, this also becomes a way to save money on marketing and promotion while still getting a lot of marketing promotion to your target audience for these Black films. So I think it's important to just kind of know that history as we go into kind of our own pop culture nostalgia for why these soundtracks came back in the 90s, and what was exciting about them, and why we love them so much, and wish that idea had endured. And last thing I'm going to say before I switch it back to AMC, since this is our topic, is just thinking about the fact that we're not talking about, there was a lot of different types of albums in the 90s that came out that we're not going to be talking about. Like the 90s is also great for tribute albums. The 90s, like Marvin is 60, People Get
Yeah.
Ready, interpretations of Stevie Wonder, Inner City Blues, the music of Marvin Gaye, a Twist of Marley, even white folks doing R&B versions of white folks like the songs of Phil Collins, Urban Renewal. We're not talking about that. And we're not talking about TV soundtracks, even though they're important. With like New York Undercover released 2 albums that helped promote the TV show, and they were mostly covers of R&B stuff from the 70s. The PJs or Shake, Rattle, and Roll, which you get kind of Billy Porter doing 50s covers and Terrence Trent D'Arby's doing 50s covers of like To Be Loved during Long Tall Sally. So that's not what we're talking about. We specifically mean movie soundtracks that help promote films while also often being kind of the introduction of artists to their audience. So I'm gonna switch it over to you, AMC. What you got?
Well, I just wanted to make it clear too that I'm not talking about soundtracks that had like particular singles that stood out. For me, I chose five, like five, or I think five or six. But I chose, and you guys are gonna notice that a few of them, of course, are commercial. But of course, I'm gonna explain why as well. But I'm talking about the albums that licked from back to back, from like tune
Did it
number
lick?
one. They licked. Okay.
Did we get to orgasm with this licking? I just want to make.
I
I want to.
mean,
How,
you
how,
may
how much
have.
licking went on with these albums, AMC?
She said
Let
from
me repeat
front
it
to
again.
back.
From front to back. Okay, they licked.
I love
Okay,
it.
that's what I said. I
Better than
said what
back
I
to
said.
front, because we know that can do some things for some sisters. I'll just
We
put
ain't
it out
going
there,
there. We ain't going there. We ain't going there.
man.
All right, y'all. Listen, okay, so the closest, honestly, that I've kind of heard from now, I mean, around now, sorry, I would say would be like Insecure's weekly playlist that used to come out. That used to have a really big hype. And that was great because their songs that they had picked for the shows were fantastic. And of course, as we had mentioned earlier, Black Panther soundtrack, especially since Riri done sang her songs and drove everybody mad. So, excuse me, it's no doubt that these soundtracks that I'm going to list here are going to be well known by many. So, number one, of course, Boomerang. Boomerang is high up on my list. That album still gets bopped today, hardcore, on repeat. It peaked at number four on the top 200 Billboard chart and number one on the R&B hip hop and R&B chart. So, as LMG had stated before about artists getting their debut, Toni Braxton got her debut from this album, and the single "Give You My Heart" with the duet with Babyface was that crazy bop from Jump. But also, "Love Should Have Brought You Home" was her actual debut single from her album. So she actually had two songs that came out from this that kind of catapulted her into her bright star that she is today. You had Tonight Is Right by Keith Washington. You had End of the Road that broke all kinds of records and achieved international success. That one spent 13 weeks at number one and also went on to win a couple of Grammys for R&B song and best R&B performance. Then you had PM Dawn's Die Without You. You had It's Gonna Be Alright that brought Aaron Hall with his musical mentor, Charlie Wilson. I mean, that album had tunes, man. It had tunes. So that's my number one pick. And again, this is not in any kind of order. Let me just run that out there too. Number two, of course, The Bodyguard. That was in 1992. And we had Whitney, who is forever breaking records. And she had this album, I think at the time, let me just dig in my notes. Okay. She held, okay, yes. So she did hold a record for being the female artist with the most weeks at number one. For 19 years, she held this record. So, and that was from The Bodyguard. She was the one to actually kick Boyz II Men to end their running. What do you call it? Their
Rain,
running.
their
Thank
reign,
you.
number one.
Yes, that's the word. That's the word. To end their running reign with End of the Road, and she spent 14 weeks at number one. Bodyguard also had Queen of the Night, I Have Nothing, I'm Every Woman. There is nobody on earth that will ever forget that video because she was pregnant with Bobby, not Bobby Brown, obviously. Shaka Khan's.
I'm mad that you feel like you needed to clarify that she was
I had
not
to
pregnant
clarify.
with
Listen,
Bobby Brown.
hey, you know what? I'm just gonna keep my mouth zipped and I'm gonna keep it moving because I can get myself in trouble with the words like gonna come out of my mouth. So the Shaka Khan cover was everything, and we can't forget that TLC was up in there. Like it was just a bopping video. So, but that song was another one that really had everybody in a chokehold for a while. Up again, another Whitney album, Waiting to Exhale, and it seems
Oh,
like
wait, wait, wait,
Babyface
wait,
had
wait.
his.
Before you go there,
What's up?
we gotta give that album a smidge more props.
The
So
Bodyguard?
yes, so
Go
the
ahead.
thing. So yes, everything to yes you said. Um, it would go on to hold that record for 19 years until about
Mhm,
the female artist one until Adele's album 21. The
mhm.
other thing that's important to note about The Bodyguard, I would have thought that the best selling soundtrack album of all times was Saturday Night Fever by the Bee Gees. It is not. The
It's not.
Bodyguard still holds the record for the best selling soundtrack of all times. How many millions do you think it takes to have that title?
Title, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I'm
I
just
mean,
thinking though, how
again,
many millions do you I have the millions in my head. So how many millions do you think it sold in order to get to the number one best selling soundtrack of all times?
oh my gosh, that's a wow.
I mean, what do you think?
Good
Is it 10
question.
million? Is it 20 million? 30 million? Adrian, what you got? What do you
Let's go
think?
for 30. I'd say 30 million.
You're gonna say 30? Adrian, what you
I
got?
Mhm.
I'm gonna go. Even I'm gonna say maybe 40.
Oh, you gonna say 40.
I
So
want to
you
say
both
40.
are good, but it's not 40 or 30. 45 million
Oh
copies
dang!
sold.
Wow, that's
Wow!
It
nuts.
beats out the Bee Gees Saturday Night Fever by 5 million copies,
Wow!
right?
Mm,
We'll never see.
Whitney,
And so, because of
ever.
the way album sales happen now, it's gonna hold that record forever. Like
Yes.
Mhm.
nobody's movie soundtrack is coming out tomorrow and selling
Right.
45 million copies. We don't even sell.
True.
There's not an artist selling. Beyonce ain't selling 40. Taylor
I was
Swift
gonna.
ain't selling
No, I was.
45 million
True.
copies.
Right? Right.
So this will
Seriously.
hold the record for all times, conceivably, for the best-selling soundtrack album. And I just think it's important to note that Whitney Houston was the co-executive producer on that album
With
with
Clive.
Clive Davis.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Roy Lott is the producer on that album, who was just like the producer for everything at Arista at the time. But
Mhm.
that, Whitney Houston helped to produce the best-selling soundtrack album of all time, and we don't give, that it's due. Not the same way we would say Thriller, right? Which is the
Right.
best selling
Yeah.
album of all time. Well, and maybe, and that
Yes.
always fights with the Eagles' greatest hits for that title, right? Like they go back
Mhm.
and forth. But anyway, so I just thought it
Mhm.
was important to note that. Go ahead, AMC.
Yeah, I think that everything that we said is truly a testament to Whitney herself as an artist, as a producer, just Whitney, the voice. You know what I mean? And then, of course, in my follow up, Waiting to Exhale, um, and Babyface again. Babyface had that magic touch in the '90s, and Waiting to Exhale had a slew of amazing talent on there, man. Exhale, shoop shoop. This was her 11th number one and last number one single. She won a Grammy for Best R&B Song. She had major international success with the song. And as I had stated with the list of amazing talent, there was Mary J with one of her most emotional tracks. A lot of people state that. Not Gonna Cry. There was Sitting Up in My Room by Brandy. There was again Tony with Let It Flow. There was some, I mean, I can go right through the album, but I will not because of time. But there were some really, really great tracks on this album. It was just sick from back to front, and Babyface and the stellar producing brought just major talent to the forefront with that one. For Love Jones, Love Jones. Adrian had
Yes.
mentioned Love Jones
Yes.
earlier, and this album, yeah, man, this album is sick. You had Hopeless and Dion Ferris's Gem. You had Lauren Hill doing her thing with The Sweetest Thing. You had Maxwell Something Something Mellow Smooth remix that was, of course, touched by R&B soul legend Leon Ware. And I mean, that was the remix too. And we had Inside My Love by Trina Broussard. That cover is crazy. Crazy cover of the Minnie Riperton classic.
Yes.
And You Move Me by Cassandra Wilson. I boy, that song is sexy as hell. Another album, of course, I can go right through, but will not. And two more left, y'all.
Okay,
Mo
wait a
Better
second.
Blues.
Wait a second before you go to the next one.
I'm jumping real quick, but go ahead.
I
Go
see
ahead.
you, but we got to have a little interjection, a little conversation.
All right. Go ahead.
Love
Go ahead.
Jones.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
what were the people giving around you when the Love Jones album came out? Like, so,
What were
because
they
I remember,
what? Say it again.
and where were you when that album came out? Because I remember very distinctly where I was and what was happening
Well,
culturally in the
let me
culture.
say. Oh, well, see, that was Montreal time. I was
Oh, you was with the white
that was
folks.
a lot of that was yeah, But we did our thing though. When Love Jones came out, the blacks got together and we had our,
All 10 of them in
our
Montreal.
cinema. Listen now. We were around. We were around. That would be in class. That's how you would count us in class, all 10 of us, all five of us. But when we got together, that was another thing. So, I
Hmm.
mean, we had our Love Jones things, we had our poetry slams, we had our this, we had our that. So there was a lot of Love Jones themed everything. Yeah, culture wise, it just don't even ask because it's not even anything up to par with like stateside what was going on. So yeah.
What about you, Alf?
There's nothing- no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, what about
Uh
you, ALT? What you got?
the
Oh,
it's funny to me that I'm not entirely sure why this movie and this soundtrack really penetrated at a time when I wasn't I was really I mean, I was PWI at that time. I was in predominantly white institutions, predominantly white social groups, listening to predominantly white music at that time. But something about this particular film and this particular soundtrack really penetrated that for me. And I really went on kind of a neo soul jag at that time. It was very into that subgenre, particularly Dion Ferris, who obviously had also worked with Arrested Development, and I just
mhm.
she's probably Hopeless is probably what really kind of pulled me in. I just think that is such an extraordinary song, and her voice
Mhm.
is incredible. She's so underappreciated and unsung as a performer, and kind of the whole. And it's funny because I'm really not into romantic films of any of any type, and so I'm not even sure how I came to see Love Jones. Um, but the soundtrack was a big part of what hooked me into the story, as well as kind of that idea of really tapping into a Black consciousness and tapping into emotions through the medium of poetry and through the medium of spoken word. And it seemed like that was
Mhm.
that was really kind of happening at that time. And like I said, I was still kind of on the periphery, on the outskirts of that, but that it resonated with me at the time for sure.
Mhm.
So I'm from Chicago, where the movie's set, and I was living in Washington D.C. at the time, and I have to say, Love Jones in Washington D.C. was more than a movie, more than a soundtrack. It began the granola backpack way of life in Washington D.C. So
Oh,
it began the I have my incense. Are you reading Francis Quest Wellesley? Are you doing bebop
Yeah.
poetry at,
The
at the
movement.
right, like at the clubs, which suddenly all of the black clubs had a poetry night where you would have the
Right.
brothers do brother of the night versions of poetry and sisters do I am a Nubian goddess of the Afro queen. Ing, ing,
Yeah.
ing, ing, ing.
And
So,
the
yeah,
like,
yeah,
and the
and
snaps. Snaps.
and the
yep, yep,
snaps,
Snap.
and the
yes,
snaps,
and the
and the
snaps.
Yeah.
natural hair, right?
Yeah.
And so, being in Black Mecca when Love Jones came out, it became a very distinct. Are you a bad boy, puffy kind of black? Or are you a Love Jones, neo soul, get into my third eye chakra kind of black? Right? Because
I know.
1997 is also the height of Bad Boy Records, right? Like, so you get peak,
Yeah.
shiny, jumping jack dancing producers. At the same time, you're getting, the introduction of Erica, the introduction of D'Angelo 2 years before that.
Mhm.
And so you getting and so this becomes like this flavor, this sound, this mood. And it was like, oh, I don't listen to that's popular. I don't do that. I do things like Trina Broussard. Are you familiar with Trina Broussard? She's this new artist. She's out of Atlanta. Like India Irie and Donnie. Like, are you hip to
It was a
them?
huge spectrum. That was my
Yeah,
Right? Like, and so, I want to make
yeah.
sure we're really situating these albums in the culture and what was really happening at the time. And so I think it's
yes,
funny, it's interesting because we're coming from
Mhm.
three different backgrounds, we live on three different continents between the three of us, or three different countries and not continents. Three different countries. And so I think it's important to think about like, so when you said "Hopeless" was the song that pulled you in, I couldn't help but chuckle a little bit because Deion Ferris was considered like Cree Summers, very on the cusp of whiteness at the time.
not
Yeah.
Very
Creaser,
kind
Yeah.
of,
not
you
Freddie.
you
Come
know,
on
it was
now.
getting. Well, that was when Cree Summers' album also came out around that time period too.
Yes,
There was like a
yes,
whole little subgenre of natural
and
hair,
I have to
but
confess,
also
I have to
hippie.
confess, I had her album.
Right. See, so you
So did
get
I.
you.
I'm not gonna lie.
I mean, you're right. So I mean, like, so that's kind of, and Deion Ferris was black because we got her through Arrested Development, but it was kind of like alternative
Right,
black. It's like the blacks that the whites like,
right.
Yeah.
like,
But when
right.
she came out with I Know, that was like, I mean, come on, that was a good balance between a little bit of, what do you want to call it, pop verse, it was a little mix of everything in I Know.
Right. But it did
I would
get
It
actually
way
wasn't
more
just
argue.
air. It,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it got way more airplay on, say, like MTV or something like that than Hopeless did.
Hmm. For sure. For
And see,
sure.
I would argue that
So
Hopeless probably brought in a white audience. I think there was a white audience that wasn't checking for no Love Jones. Because Love Jones is one of those rare black films that has a Criterion Collection release, right? Like that's like the pinnacle of
true.
film
Yes.
releases. So that meant white folks knew about Love Jones and was checking for Love Jones.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
songs like Hopeless and that soundtrack helped draw them in. You know, Cassandra Wilson, got a jazz chanteuse.
Yes.
When black folks
Yeah.
weren't really, we
Hmm.
were checking for jazz. This is kind of the height of Roy Hargrove. This is the height of the young tenors and the resurgence of black
Hmm.
folks' interest in jazz. but Cassandra
And
Wilson's
Lauren Hill
audience was
too.
largely white. So I think you get some of that from this soundtrack that's helping to bridge people who think of themselves as very sophisticated, very articulate, very educated, very above what's going on down there in bad boy land. Right? Right? I think that's you kind of get that in 1997 as well. But I loved it, and I loved that this is one of your picks. Go ahead for your
Yeah.
next two.
Mo Better Blues. I chose Mo Better Blues because I'm obsessed with that movie. I love it immensely. And it actually turned me on to Terrence Blanchard. I did love Branford Marsalis before then. Um, when I listen to jazz, I'm not like a huge jazz aficionado, but I do like jazz. So when this came out and it had a great balance of a little bit of a interjection of hip hop with pop top four sorry jazz thing with Gangstar. Then there was the pop top 40. There's Mo Better Blues. There was what was her name? Cinda Williams sang her version of Mo Better Blues as well on the soundtrack. So it was a really, really nice soundtrack. It was tight from beginning to end too, and it really did balance out really well um, with both Bleak and Shadow, with the characters played by excuse me, Wesley Snipes and Denzel Washington, with their stance on their vast individual perspectives on music. And lastly, I had to go over this one again because Have Plenty. I know LMG, you and I spoke about this previously, but Have Plenty, I had to actually go back to look at the soundtrack to make sure that I liked every track on that soundtrack. And I actually did. Because I always remember Fire was my tune. That was with Babyface and Desiree. They did such a wonderful cover of that track, and I killed it. I killed that shit out. I'm not even gonna lie. Tears Away, Faith, Any Other Night, Chico DeBarge, What I've Been Missing, Changing Faces, um, SWV, Where You Are, their cover, fantastic. Um, Have Plenty had some like I hate that movie now that I watched it again. I was like, what the ass is this? But but Have Plenty on the whole, this soundtrack is stellar from beginning to end for me. I had to add that one in real quick because it was a independent film too from what I do remember, but it wasn't one of those things that films that really caught you to say, oh, I'm gonna run and watch that again. It was more the soundtrack where we give the soundtrack props because it had some really great heavy hitters on there from beginning to end. And those are my picks, y'all.
Well, we got to give a shout out to Erica Badu's Yayo from that
Yeah, yo,
album.
for sure.
And
Yes.
Yes.
as you mentioned, SWV's Jackson 5 cover, I Want to Be Where You Are, is probably my favorite version of because it's been covered a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
SWV's version of I Want to Be Where You Are, where, something about their chipmunk harmonies make that work really well for that.
Chipmunk. I love it.
Right? Like I think it's giving it what it needs to be given. Like it's fun and kind of arcade gamey. It does a thing. It does a
It
thing.
works. It works. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
you know, and it's funny. I remember when we originally had this conversation about Mo Better Blues. I actually always think of Mo Better Blues as a 1980s, late 80s film, but you were reminding me, no, that came out like 1990. Um,
Hmm.
and Wesley Snipes becomes a breakout star from that. So I mean, I always think of that in that way. Um, it has, like most Spike Lee films, really bad gender politics. Like,
Hmm.
I don't.
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
think it kind of fits up there as black movies that we might want to revisit about whether or not it should be canon, right? But and we get his dad, right? Like I'm about to say Bill T. Jones, and that's a different Bill Jones or Bill Lee.
Oh
Bill
yeah.
Lee, right? So Bill T. Right, I'm about to give the choreographer and dancer to making him Spike Lee's daddy. That's funny in all kind of ways,
Yes,
including
multiple
unintentionally
levels.
comical ways. Little queer humor in there. Anyway, right? Like Bill Lee's orchestrations and stuff are in there. His original jazz compositions are. So I always think about that. But I think like you, Terrence Blanchard got introduced to me through that album, and then I was checking for Terrence Blanchard after that. Because I was heavy in a jazz phase in the '90s too. I was like really into both bebop and hard bop jazz from the '50s and '60s, and young cats like Christian McBride and Joshua Redman and Roy Hargrove, and who were reviving those
Yeah,
sounds
yeah, yeah.
and making them more
Right.
contemporary. So yeah, that's what's up. And I think what's interesting about that Tony Braxton album in the beginning, the soundtrack for Boomerang, is that it doesn't get the same kind of love as Waiting to Excel, but it should. As you pointed out, like in addition to them being all bangers, um, I think two of those songs end up going back onto Tony, or maybe only one of those songs end up going on Tony Braxton's album. But Love Should Have Brought You Home Last Night was more than a song. It became like one of those cultural cachet conversation things that showed up in Def Comedy Jam jokes, came up in
Hmm.
other movies. It came up as
Hmm.
a quote that women would give to their men on a regular basis. Like it went way beyond just a song, kind of like Karen White's Superwoman. It became way past that to
Right.
something that was part of our lexicon for a while. So those are
Hmm.
great
Hmm.
picks. You got any thoughts, ALT, about it? About the five?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of those same picks, and it's amazing that you said have plenty because, that was a film that I saw at that time. I remember really liking a lot of the stuff on the soundtrack. I went through this weird little Desiree phase where I was really into her, and her first album, and so it's the lyrically it's really weak, but I really loved her voice, and I loved the whole vibe that she was giving off. And she's very much a part of that. Had she been, I think, an American artist rather than an artist from the UK, she probably would have been in that neo soul slot because she was very much about, in terms of the kind of the spirituality and the soulfulness and sort of that kind of pseudo hippie vibe that surrounded the neo soul movement or some aspects of it. And so I think she would have slotted in there perfectly well. Um, and then of course we've got Erica Badu as well. And Erica Badu she's my hometown girl. She's my home girl, from Dallas, Booker T. I mean, so that
Right.
was
Right.
there you go. So that was very much a part of kind of my soundtrack. The film itself um is, yeah, it's got some issues, um particularly with the performances. It does not
Right.
hold up. Yeah, they're very weak. It is poorly acted, I'm sorry, I have to
Oh,
say
so
it.
bad.
And yeah, and I think it really kind of the attention that it got, I think really it sort of rode on that wave, that indie, black indie film wave, and it kind of papered over some of the weaknesses of the film. But the soundtrack is the strongest part of it, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned Have Plenty as well.
Why y'all hating? Why y'all hating on the one time filmmaker? like
Bro.
y'all, like it's look that I got one of my favorite lines that I stole from Have Plenty. I was in my 20s, so this was acceptable at the time. I was like 22 or something when the movie came out. So, and it was like, I want you to think I'm the sexiest. If you don't think I'm the sexiest motherfucker in the room, then I can't be with you.
Oh my God.
This became the mantra. I don't care if you think it's true or
Yes.
not. If you don't think I'm the sexiest motherfucker in the room, then I can't be with you.
Yes.
Even if you got to
I
lie
love
to
the
yourself.
delivery, especially.
Right. Right. So yes, Have Plenty was doing something at a different level, a different vibrational level. Y'all just don't appreciate the vibration it was on. But like
Oh, okay.
a lot of those movies from that period, like Sprung comes to mind from that same kind of era
Oh yeah.
where they would have like one good thing about it and the rest was trash. Like the opening for Sprung was him walking into a party and having his kind of internal dialogue be this computer reading the people for filth. Or it was a her. I think it might have been her walking to the party and reading the people for filth and like breaking down who ain't had no job, who was stunting, whose teeth was fucked up. Like, and it's like the funniest part of the whole film. And then it's downhill from there. It's like, oh, you got into the
Yeah.
room based on this opening, and then from there it was just like whatever. But look, it's like the '70s black exploitation era. You got the good, the bad, and the real, real ugly from
For
that
Yep.
real.
period. But we was glad black folks was working. We were glad to go see those films. I want to round off the list that AMC has provided with some things that people may have forgotten, some songs. You can make your own little playlist from these songs. We might actually put down a little listing of some of these so you can go look them up. But Love and Basketball soundtrack gave us Michelle
Mm-hmm.
Indiacello, Fool of Me. Let me tell you something about Fool of Me. We're gonna talk about a song that's gonna make me cry and sit and with
Oh no.
myself with his Christmas
Woo!
times in silence. Look, Fool of Me was had me thinking about my life choices at that age. Um, Donnell Jones, I'll Go. This is when Donnell Jones was like the king of the
Mm-hmm.
one song that we all would be loving and checking for. He had this album. We all loved the Where I Want to Be album. Then after that, it was kind of like the song. It was the
Yeah.
song. So this was one of his songs. Angie Stone's cover of Simply Red's "Holding Back the Years." This is when Angie is kind of at her height as one of the only dark skinned full figure women of the era that's, acceptable and slaying and getting accolades and getting a coin, you know, um, paving the way for other sisters like Kelly Price, and eventually kind of a Lizzo. But we get an Angie Stone that is literally slaying Simply Red's Holding Back the Years. Like, that's actually one of my favorite covers of that song. We get Down in the Delta during this era with D'Angelo's cover of Heaven Must Be Like This. Tony Thompson, may he rest in peace. And Antoinette's We Belong Together. Luther Vandross is on this album. And Cassandra Wilson again, before she started saying some things and got herself a little canceled with some black folks.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob
Mm-hmm.
James. We got I'm Only Human. All of them are I'm Only Human. And then you get Shaka Khan's Don't Talk to Strangers. Brown Sugar soundtrack gave us my favorite theme song of the era. With Most Def featuring Faith Evans on the title track with the interpolation of Norman
Yeah.
Connor's Invitation featuring Miss Adarita. Miss Aretha, who sings down, and I'm like, I actually don't know where Faith Evans ends and Miss Aretha on that sample begins because it sounds like the same. It's killing it either way. We also get Rasan Patterson, who was like also a king of doing songs from soundtracks at this era. For You Make Life So Good, you get Love of My Life, an ode to hip hop featuring Erica
Trapped.
Badu and Common, all on the
Yes.
Brown Sugar soundtrack. We don't get a whole lot from Two Can Play That Game, but it is the first time we hear Kiki Wyatt sing Patti LaBelle's If Only You Knew, which is significant because Kiki has now gone on to sing that song as if it was her song forevermore. Rasan Patterson's So Hot, we get off of that. Clockers. Clockers was like Love Jones was one of those snooty people soundtracks.
I
Mark,
forgot about that. Wow.
which,
Cloggers.
also a Spike Lee production, gave us
Mm-hmm.
Mark Dorsey's People in Search of a Life, Shaka Khan's Love Me Still, which I think is like one of her most gorgeous songs of the era. Speaking again of Spike Lee, we give us Crooklyn with Mark Dorsey's People Make the World Go Round from that. I know we not really supposed to say his name, so we'll just name the songs from the Life soundtrack from He Who Shall Not Be Named, which
Mm.
included forever gems like Maxwell's Fortunate, Kelly Price's
Yeah.
It's Gonna Rain, Casey and JoJo's
Mm-hmm.
Life, and City High. Remember City High? 5'5" with brown
Of
eyes.
course.
Whatever happened to Polo
Oh
City
my
High?
gosh.
They was trying.
Of
They was
course.
trying Ryan Toby and this. What was that little light skinned girl name? She was trying to.
I
They was
forgot.
trying. They tried to do a little something with what would you do? They had a little moment. They had a
That's
little
true.
moment. Claudette, I think was her
Somebody even
name.
sent Wyclef a message.
Look, right? My personal favorite, one of my personal favorite movies of this era is not actually a black movie, but the soundtrack is black as fuck. It's Living Out Loud is the movie. Run, do not walk to go see it. It will make you feel good. It is a feel good, gorgeous movie
Wait,
from the era.
this is Queen
But
Latifah,
you
Holly
get,
Hunter, correct?
yes, amazing movie.
Okay.
Is one of my favorite movies of all time. And it gives us Queen Latifah's Going Out of My Head, Queen Latifah singing Lush Life and nailing it. Lush Life is one of the hardest compositions by Billy Strayhorn to sing. Be Anything But Be Mine. So you get a trifecta of Queen Latifah doing jazz. This is when the people weren't necessarily sure they could take Queen Latifah's singer seriously. She since squashed those ideas, but there was a period. We were like, Queen Latifah doing what? She's doing what? It's jazz what? Like, but this was the
Uh,
beginning of her saying, yes, yes, bitches, I can sing. I can sing.
mhm.
Um, Clark Anderson, Give Me Something Real, which is a gorgeous ballad. Ray Charles's cover of Hard Times from the 1950s. Uh, and Brownstone has a whole dance number that is in the centerpiece of Living Out Loud doing If You Love Me, which is quite arguably their biggest hit that everybody knows. Right? Like, I don't know that anybody knows.
Definitely.
I mean, there might be some Brownstone fans who knows a
And
lot
their
other
album
other
was
songs.
good.
The album was very good, but If
It
You
was
Love Me
damn
has
good.
gone on to stand the test of time as one of the
For
best
sure.
songs ever.
Mhm.
You also get, let's talk about some introductions. Billy Porter gets introduced with Love Is on the Way on the First Wives Club. Again, not a 90. So this is where we start getting into albums where white folks was the stars of the movie, but the movie soundtrack was suddenly had some black folks all over it.
I love how you say suddenly.
Suddenly the black folks is good enough to sing on the white people movie stuff. So you
Mhm.
get Billy Porter, Love Is on the Way. Unfortunately, this gets stolen from him not even a year later by Celine Dion.
He's an ultimate stealer anyway, so
Which is
let me
one of
not
the reasons
start.
why we would not really know of Billy Porter for another decade. Right? Game of Love by Brownstone. I Will Survive by Sante Savage. This version of the Gloria Gaynor hit was the one of the big songs from that year. Over and Over
Mhm.
by Puff Johnson, another woman we thought
She was
was going to be like the Mariah Carey of our times and did not end up doing that, but she has a beautiful debut album
we
that
did?
people should check out. I remember there was a lot because Puff could sing. You could say what you will about them songs.
Oh, she no, no,
Puff could
no.
sing.
No shade. No
Puff
shade.
could
That
Puff
album
could
was
blow.
fantastic.
Right.
She
And we
can,
thought,
but I
we thought
never
that
knew
we
all of
the
that.
90s is full of people. We were like, oh, okay, they gonna be, and then they weren't that. They did not end up being that. We don't know what happened to them, but you know, I give you an example of this. For me, there is a great performance on God, what is the name of this? Oh, what's the worst thing that can happen? Which is an awful movie with Danny DeVito and some people. But there's a cover by
Mhm.
Sam Logan, who now goes by Samson Logan, cover of Maze's Happy Feelings. And it is amazing. It is an amazing cover. And you couldn't tell me that Sam Logan album wasn't gonna come back out in the next year. He wasn't gonna serve it to the people. Didn't happen. Never heard from Sam Logan again. If you look on YouTube, you will find some Samson Logan things, but
Hmm.
nothing comes close to what he did with Happy Villas. It was just like you had a 15 minutes of fame moment in the sun, and then it was nothing. So it was like,
That's it.
yeah. I mean, and so
Oh,
you got just kind of a lot of things that were happening. Frank McComb does a duet with Daryl Coley. Your Future is Our Future, which is not a really good song, but look, it's Frank McComb and Daryl Coley on the Meteor Man soundtrack at that time. And Frank
oh
McComb on
dear.
Somebody Cares for You, that's co-produced by Gerald Levert during McComb's
Mm.
Motown tenure. You get Space Jams, which gives you For You I Will by Monica, Fly Like an Eagle by Seal, I Believe I Can Fly by He Who Shall Not Be Named, and D'Angelo's I Found My Smile Again. This era just had great, great songs. Last one I'm gonna mention only because it's being made into a TV series now. Hoodlum, the movie, which is now just got optioned this
Yeah.
week to be a TV series, which I'm
Mhm.
still like not sure how I feel about that. Kind of feel like we already have the
Same.
Godfather of Harlem. I don't
And
know
because
why we,
and because
huh?
of the story too. And because of the storyline too. I'm not too sure we're really there. If it was Sicily,
Ye-
I think you know what I mean? Like if it was
Yeah.
Cicely Tyson kind of reprising the role, people would watch it because it's Sicily. But it's not, and I don't really care about the character. So why?
Yeah, I remember Hoodlum being like cute for its day, like at its
It was
time.
okay.
I don't
Mhm.
necessarily know that I needed more of it. But look,
Right,
we gave
agree.
us Adriana Evans, for those who want to blast from the past name, who's still out here doing stuff on an
Mhm.
independent tip. But Miss Adriana Evans was
Mhm.
one of those it girls for the backpack kids. She had did us Lucky Days. You get Rasan Patterson's cover of the Crusaders featuring Randy Crawford's Street Life, which is to die for. 112
Mhm.
and Faith Evans give us I Can't Believe. Davina, remember Davina? Oh, that was a good album. Baby, people,
That
please
was a
go get Davina's
fantastic album.
debut solo album. Oh my God. Uh, but
What
you
was it?
get her
Because
featuring
that's the one that
Raekwon
she
on
did.
So Good. You get Erica Badu, which we've mentioned enough times that we now think that she might be the reigning queen of the Black soundtrack. Like, for her, certainly, for certainly not me. For those who want to hear the full, remember the full little quote. And Chico DeBarge's No Guarantee are all on that album. So just good stuff, And then there were some albums that were less notable from the period. Ride, which gave us kind of Trina and Tamara with Something for the People. Speaking of groups that kind of were bubbling under and never kind of gave us what was
I
necessary.
didn't see that going anywhere, but okay. Exactly.
I mean,
You
look, they
hit it
were
right
a
on the nose.
thing. Look, they tried to be a
They
thing. Like
were.
I remember their videos. I remember their videos with them really bad hooks. Um,
Mhm.
but anyway, look, and if you want to, your girl Deion Ferris again, she does a cover of Stevie Wonder's and the Temptations for "Once in My Life" on, well, also one of my favorite rom coms of the era, "The Truth About Cats and Dogs."
Oh, I had forgotten
So
completely about that. Okay, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I had forgotten. I really liked that movie for something that's typically out of my genre. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a big romantic comedy fan, but I did particularly like that film. I think at the time I was kind of I was a fan of Janine Garofalo, so that's probably why I saw it to begin with.
Mhm.
And I had forgotten all about that. So very cool.
yeah, yeah, you got some. That was the thing about '90s soundtracks. You just never knew what you were gonna get, and like as a crate digger, I was a deep crate digger in the '90s. You were like pouring over these albums just to try to find that song. I remember like Grace of My Heart is another film from that period, and I was deeply into Portrait, and they do a song called In Another World. And For Real was doing a song called I Do and Love That Boy. And both of them are like '90s era R&B, hardcore R&B folks, but they were doing doo-wop songs from the '60s era, and it was just nice to hear them stretch and like show us what else they could do. Or you would get like a rare duet like Brenda Russell and Alita Adams together on We Will Find a Way on the Karina soundtrack, or Javetta Steele doing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, or her family Distille's doing This Little Light of Mine on that soundtrack. Like these moments, like that, even if the soundtrack wasn't good cover to cover, like the Licky experiences that AMC was having with her five. Like
The
they might not
leaky? No,
they
that
might
don't sound right.
they might not have brought you to
That don't sound
orgasm.
right.
They might not have brought you to orgasm, but they gave you a little zing. They gave you a little zest. They gave you a little moment of pleasure. So
Yes,
anyway,
sir.
in closing out this topic, what do we want to say about the '90s era soundtracks, black soundtracks, and what stories did they tell that we want to hear again? Like, do we? I mean, these were kind of commercial marketing tools. I don't know that people are into music videos the same way they were in the '90s, even though videos are still made. I don't know that again, we'll never see a 45 million album sold like The Bodyguard again. Like, so, what is it that we want from that era? What is it that we're hungry and nostalgic for, and that these soundtracks give us?
Adrian, go
Oh, my
ahead. Go
radio
first, girl.
silence. So the people
Oh,
got real quiet when I got deep. See, when I was funny, the people had a lot to say. They was talking over me and stuff. But when I try to go serious, the people ain't got nothing for me. Y'all see how it is, audience, right? Y'all see.
I
okay.
mean, no. Go, Adrian. Go ahead, girl.
I was just going to say, just briefly. So for me, um, there is an element of nostalgia there, but because I wasn't as immersed in these films and these soundtracks at the time, for me, it's kind of about a rediscovery. It's about a connection to something that I missed, that I feel like I should have had an experience of, a stronger and deeper experience of. And I think there was a certain um, a communal experience where, as AMC said, the community went and supported these films, and bought these soundtracks, and helped take these songs to the top of the charts, the ones that were successful on the charts. And so I think there's a communal experience there that, as we've talked about, we don't have anymore, because um soundtracks don't necessarily drive films in the same way that they used to. The record selling model, and the whole music business, the whole industry and platforms have changed so significantly, and the way charts are constructed, and all of that, and just the way people access music has changed. And so I think that's something that we're missing, is that communal experience, where everybody knew these songs, everybody had seen these movies, even me, even though I didn't see them necessarily when they were immediately released in the theaters. I knew about them. It was just something that I needed to connect to, and so for me, it's kind of a, like I said, it's kind of a reconnect to that. But I think that's what it is. I think it's a community and a community experience that people are trying to get back.
Nice. AMC?
Yeah, I really do believe in that for sure, because the I think with the community experience, you see how 90s music, just as I said earlier, has us in a chokehold. It's music that we still play now. How many years later? It's, I think, music that we're still going to play many years later again. And even with kids growing up now, they see and know the connection that we have with 90s music, and we play it ad nauseum. We still have 90s parties. We dress up in 90s gear, and like everything is 90s orientated. And I think music is the soundtrack to our lives. For a lot of people growing up in the 90s were a great time musically, creatively. It was kind of like the burgeoning of, just blackness. It's a black thing you wouldn't understand, and all of these things. I think, as you said, about community, that everyone kind of had that thing to relate to. Everyone had that thing that they could have a conversation about. When those black movies dropped, it was like a bomb. It was, everybody had to be sure to be at the movie theater on Tuesday nights whenever these movies were released. And when there was a black movie that was being released, all the blacks descended upon the theaters in Montreal anyways. But there was that communal thing. So if you didn't see it or you didn't rock with it, you were left out. Um, so I totally and wholeheartedly agree with what Adrian said about community. And again, I just 90s music, I don't know. I still would like to know what it is that resonates so deeply within all of us when it comes to 90s music. But I know for a fact that 90s music is here forever and a day to stay. And let me add on to that a lot of great music was made during the 90s. And I feel like even the one hit wonders could actually sing back then, even though some of the one hit wonders were lip syncing some shit, but they could still sing. This is the thing, is that they could still sing. So we had some singing people in the 90s that were doing some things. And those are the same things that we're still listening to today. So yeah,
I think
that's my thing.
for my closeout, I think one I was, in the era that we're discussing, 1990, I was 15. In the year 2000, I was 25. So most, science tells us most of us gravitates towards the music that we were listening to in our teens and in our 20s. I mean, lucky for me as a music critic, I got to extend that era probably for another 20 years. It's probably only until I was about 40 before I really started getting turned off to the music of the day and started having more and more trouble finding music that resonated with me. But way past a lot of my peers who were like, there's no good music after 1999. And I was like, there's tons of good music out there. That's great. And now by
Hmm, hmm.
2020, I was kind of like, oh, there's no good music. Like, right. Like it took like another 20
Yeah.
years for me than my peers. But so I think that there's something about that, scientifically speaking, we do gravitate towards what was our youthful halcyon days. Emotionally, we were much more emotional beings in our teens and 20s, right? Everything is big. The songs are big. We have associations of people to those songs and dates and relationships and crying jags, right? Like in a way that we may not do as we get older. So I think there's a little bit of that. I also think in the 90s is funny because we do have a little bit of revisionist history. In the 90s, I remember all of our love was about the 70s. right? We all wanted it to be the 1970s again. We all were like,
Yeah,
we were doing 70s
obsessed.
parties. We were like, the music we were listening to that we were obsessing over was 70s music. And
Hmm.
so, and you get that in neo soul. That's kind of the genesis of neo soul, right? Is that longing, that desire for the music that we grew up with from our parents, who was playing us songs from the 60s and 70s and early 80s, right? And so I think that there's something to that. And you had to sing, though this is also the advent of a lot of runs. And I remember black folks weren't so keen on everybody doing 50-11 runs in the 1990s, when that started being the trend, when all of the folks who were influenced by Commissioned and by the Clark sisters had come of age in the 90s and were artists, and they were like trying to do their versions of Fred Hammond or their versions of Karen Clark Sheard in the 90s. And so it's interesting that now we totally accept that style of singing as somebody who can sing, but at the time it was thought of a little bit as doing a bit too much. The 70s have folks who did a lot more improvisational jazz type of growls and funk and soulful howls and church squalls in their singing, that was inventive. If you think about somebody like Luther Vandross, who didn't do a lot of runs, but was constantly reinventing himself musically, in the from his jingle days. Like, how do you make this memorable? You do a little something in there from like that would make a jingle or a commercial memorable, and he brought that to his music. So I think some of that is there in that 90s nostalgia, which is also harkens back to the genesis and the seeds of the 70s. But I think as we close out, what I want us most to think about and remember is that black folks was pioneering things that the industry doesn't give us credit for. Black folks pioneered introducing something other than classical music into musical scores through artists like Quincy Jones. We gave you the first number one R&B song, movie score, soundtrack number that will win the Oscar, revolutionizing the commercial possibilities for Hollywood to be able to have another revenue stream through these albums, another marketing vehicle through these albums. We did it again in the 90s, um, introducing you to artists like Tony Braxton and Erica Badu and any number of artists who got their start by having their song placed on a soundtrack that would be part of the marketing and promotion of these films that are themselves historic in the grand scheme of things. And so, black folks and black music was saving Hollywood's ass in the 70s. And we were saving the bottom line for a lot of black films, who white folks wouldn't go see. And so, yeah, I think, I love the fact that Whitney Houston gets to hold the record potentially forever for the best selling soundtrack of all times. And it's black. As much as I love Saturday Night Fever and the Bee
Hmm.
Gees, they don't get to hold a record. Right? We do.
Yeah.
And that's black genius, and that these soundtracks are an
Hmm.
extension of black genius. And let's see what new thing we
Yeah.
going to pioneer, because we seem to do like every 20, 30 years we pioneer something else that the
Hmm.
folks ain't think about,
It's
didn't
what
know
we
was
do.
possible.
That
This
yeah,
is what we
yeah.
do.
That is what we do.
It's
Yes.
what we
And
do.
the fact, let me just say real quickly, the fact that these soundtracks, they were doing dual work, because you talked early on in the intro about the score, the distinction between a soundtrack and a film score. And I think in a lot of these movies, I'm thinking of one we didn't talk about, but something that another soundtrack that wasn't it, I don't know that it I don't know that it would pass AMC's test because it really only had a few individual really strong songs. But I think collectively as a soundtrack, it did its job, in moving the narrative and setting character. And that the film I'm thinking of is New Jack City. Um,
Oh
Oh no,
yes,
that
yes.
definitely passed my
yeah,
test. That soundtrack is
yeah,
Yeah,
phenomenal.
and
we did miss
yeah,
Yeah.
that.
yeah. We had the, we had the
We
Teddy
did.
Riley and the New Jack Swing going on, and
That's
Yeah,
right.
Chris
yes,
Williams is does
yes,
his little
I'm
don't
Yes,
baby I'm
dreaming.
dreaming and all
I
of that
like
and
this
that.
I'm
song.
dreaming.
Yes.
That song is a bop. And
Yes.
Hmm.
but it did that dual role that I think soundtracks did in the 90s as opposed to other periods where the songs worked individually, but they also did that narrative work as, as part of the soundscape and the landscape of the film. It pushed the story forward. It told us who these characters were. It established the setting. They did all of those
Right.
things that we typically only think
Hmm.
of a film score doing. And there were,
Hmm.
there were other instances of that, but I think it was probably, I think it was probably strongest in the 90s, maybe the 70s too, but definitely in the 90s. And that's something else that is not given proper credit, because that's, straddling that line and doing that dual work. That's a tough gig, and so many films managed to those soundtracks were put together in such a way, and they were interspersed and interpolated throughout the films in such a way that they did that work.
No, thank you for
Yeah,
that.
that's a
And we did
phenomenal.
forget it.
Mhm.
Go ahead. You were gonna say MC?
No, I was gonna say that's a really phenomenal use of soundtrack, because that exactly what you said. Like I can't even believe we forgot about it. Like that soundtrack had so much weight. It had so much weight with the movie and the music, as you said. It was so well placed, and it did do a dual role. It did capture a lot of the movie like sequences that you can actually see playing out in your head as you're listening to the songs, and knowing where they're placed and how they function within the movie. So yeah, you're 100% right with that, and I'm still flabbergasted that we even forgot about it. Great pick, Adrian.
To that point, and we really are going to wrap it up because we're way over our time that we said we set for ourselves. But we did not mention Jungle Fever, which was Stevie Wonder's
Mhm.
contribution to this era, and also a New Jack
Mhm.
Swing and R&B period album, 1991. And we get from it "Gotta Have You," "Fun Day," "These Three Words," which were all hits, not just in the States, but globally. We had some hits out for this album. And my personal favorite from his, and I looked for this forever for the maxi single for "Gotta Have You," just for the B-side, which was "Feeding Off the Love of the Land," which is one of my favorite Stevie Wonder compositions of all time. Um, Definitely check it out. You can find it on streaming easy now. But back then, you had to search for the maxi single for Gotta Be. It closes out Jungle Fever with a dot bouncing on each of the words of the song as it introduces the song to the audience as the closing of the film, which is just magical in and of itself. So yeah, these albums often were doing narrative work. Love Should Have Brought You Home Last Night by Tony Braxton is a song that coincides with a line from Halle Berry to Eddie Murphy in the story, right? And so it's not just the song to be a song; it also does some narrative heavy lifting. So you're absolutely correct. Love this conversation, folks, but we got to wrap it up. This is the new and improved Gibson Gazette. AMC, you want to close us out?
Sure, sure. This is the Gibson Gazette signing off as we wonder, what are the stories you're telling the world? Better still, what are the stories you're telling yourselves? Have a great night, my peoples, and we'll see you next time. Good night.